everyone. Welcome to the hopefully fairly brief lecture video for Chapter 2, which is Speech, the Words You Say. And it starts on page 15. So I just wanted to kind of take you through a few key points and some sort of ideas I have about ways of consolidating some of these points and really thinking about them in a nice structured way. So really this is a chapter, I think in many ways, about audience. Really, I want to kind of talk about three key things, which is audience, purpose, and format of the presentation, or occasion is what Allie calls it in the textbook. So you're really thinking about, why am I doing this presentation? Who am I presenting to? And how, in what context am I presenting? And those three pieces, I think, will, when you put them together, help you decide what you're going to say. So as you think about audience, this textbook has a number of audiences delineated for you that you might be presenting to. If you're presenting at a conference, you're likely presenting to people in your field or maybe in adjacent fields. And so they have kind of a higher level of background knowledge in your subject, and also an inherent interest in what you're going to be saying. Whereas if you're presenting to the general public, that's a little different. Why should they listen to you? Why is this important? There's maybe a little aspect of persuasion in there before you even inform them of something, so even as you think about your purpose, my purpose is to inform, there might be a little persuasive element to it. You might have a little bit of salesiness there. Here's why this is important and why you should pay attention to me. A few key points that I noticed as I went through here is, as you're thinking about audience, it's not just, will the audience understand? Of course, you need to ask yourself, will the audience understand? But that secondary question is really important too. Will they be interested? How can I make them interested? How can I speak to their concerns, the audience's concerns? If it is somebody that you are applying for funding from, the way you're going to speak to them and the way you're going to want to focus that communication is going to be really different than if you're presenting, let's say, a really similar topic to a room full of undergraduate students whom you're teaching. Two totally different audiences. Somebody who might fund your project is going to want to know, how can this pay off in the long run? How is this groundbreaking? There may be similar aspects. If you're talking to a room full of undergraduate students, you might actually have some parts of your presentation that would be similar for both audiences. But I think a lot of the ways that you approach it would be different in order to make it of interest to each of those audiences. I think some really helpful tips here are, if you can learn about the audience beforehand, however you learn about that audience beforehand, it helps with the nervousness, but it also helps you tailor what you're doing to that audience. So if you are teaching, if that's one of the reasons that you are taking this class, that you're planning on teaching, and you're kind of wondering, what does a group of undergraduates know about X, Y, or Z? About my topic. What does a group of undergraduates care about? A great way to learn is to meet some undergraduates. And you don't have to go out of your way. Really, I think sometimes even just on the first few days of class, as you get to know your students, if you take that time to get to know your students, you'll be able to fine-tune what you do throughout the semester. For a one-time presentation, like a conference or something like that, if you head into the room a little early, start chatting with people, make yourself at ease with them, get a feel for them and for their backgrounds, it is a lot easier to tailor your body language and your enthusiasm and your level of formality to that audience. The author here does talk about one example of a presenter who gave the same presentation 3 times in one day, and each time it was a little bit different, tailored to the audience. And I've noticed this too. So sometimes I teach During the regular semester, I teach back-to-back sections of technical writing to upper level undergraduates, so juniors and seniors. And it's the same content. I do it back-to-back, Monday and Wednesday. So the sort of decision of what I'm going to cover is pretty set. However, I do tailor it differently sometimes. Sometimes I have a class that's really quiet. They're not that eager to jump in and discuss something. Sometimes I have a class that's really boisterous and they love that aspect of discussion. So I might have the same content that I want to cover, and with my first class, let's say the louder, more sort of boisterous class, I might open the room for questions and people start jumping in and adding their voices to the discussion. If I am then following this up with another class and I know they're more quiet, I might actually split them into pairs to begin with. Have them work with each other to sort of voice their opinions on whatever it is, write a few things down, and then bring it back to the class and ask each little pair, what did you all come up with? What did you all come up with? What did you all come up with? So a very different approach, same content, two different audiences. And even though like they on paper should be the same audience, right? Oh, they're all undergraduate engineering students in the McKelvey School. They're different. And so even a class or a group of people in a room can have a different feel about them than a really similar group that you just saw. And that really does happen to me fairly often with back-to-back classes. And I often have to tailor things differently. Sometimes it takes me a different amount of time to get through stuff, depending on the class and how many questions they have. So even when you plan, oh, this is what I've planned, you have this opportunity to adapt on the fly. It feels a little weird to say that now. If you're new to teaching, of course, those first few times you might kind of have your plan and stick with it. But as you work through it, as you get more of a feel for how to interact with your students as an audience, that's something you can do. You can adapt from class to class to class. Tailor your examples and your stories to the audience, to their concerns, to their experience. And part of that, I think, requires a little leap of the imagination. It requires a little bit of trying to put yourself in that audience's shoes. If you're presenting to researchers in your field, think yourself about what it's like to sit in a conference room, maybe Zoom now, but back when we had live conferences. When you've been to conferences, what do you feel as an audience member? Which presentations have been the most engaging to you? How and why? When you're presenting to people in your own field, essentially you're presenting to people who have a similar level of interest and knowledge as you do. So you can actually think about, hey, what do I like when I'm the audience? Which presentations have been most engaging for me? And you can then tailor your visuals, your stories, your way of approaching the presentation to that audience. Sometimes, though, it does take more imagination. If you're presenting to a group of teenagers, you might have to remember what it was like to be a teenager. And what made you very interested in science at that age, or technology? What were the things that inspired you? And you might really kind of think about that. If you want, you could even talk to some people, if you know teenagers in your life and you want to talk to them about like, oh, what would be an interesting way to approach this? Or if I were to explain this to you, could you tell me which parts were boring or which parts were interesting? Sometimes doing a test run on somebody in your target audience is a really great way to get feedback. So often, though, your presentation could be for multiple audiences. You could actually have multiple people that you're trying to hit with the same presentation. People who have an inherent interest in what you're doing, maybe researchers in your field. But if you're at an academic conference that's got a broader focus, you might have researchers who are not in your field. Okay, they're interested in the science. they are researchers, and so there's a certain level of common ground that you can have there, but you might have to explain some things that people in your field would already know. And so it's a fine balance of how do I make this not boring for the people in my field, but understandable and interesting for the people not in my field. And I think Allie has a really nice explanation here. It is on page 24, and it's figure 2.2. And it's this idea of it, and also the paragraphs that go along with it. This idea of, okay, you can't be all things to all people at all times, but you can make at least part of the presentation really engaging to one audience, and then the next part really engaging to another audience. So somebody who's less technical can forgive the 2 minutes or 3 minutes of your presentation that were very highly technical, because you reel them back in with something that's of interest to them. Or if if it's a presentation and you've got some people in your field and some people not in your field, the parts tailored towards the people not in your field maybe are a little bit more like, they're maybe a little more basic for those in your field. If they're still kind of entertaining, if they're still interesting, it might be an okay review for people who are in your field. They might still find it engaging, even though they already know it. Even if they don't find it all that engaging, you'll reel them back in with technical details from in your field. And so switching, kind of rotating through those pieces, you can have a little something for everyone, even if the entire presentation isn't fully engaging to everyone. Often though, when you present in your academic career, you won't have that much of a mixed audience. It will be either a conference or a classroom or a lab meeting with the people who are already inherently interested in what's going on in your lab. If you're pitching something to investors, it would often just be to investors. It wouldn't be investors plus the general public or something like that. So that's always nice if you have kind of a single audience, or maybe 2 groups in your audience, but they're all researchers, so at least they have that in common. But really kind of planning ahead of time and thinking about like who's going to be there is a really important thing to do. So as we think about different purposes for presentations, there are a lot of different purposes. Some of the key ones we're going to look at here in this class are to inform, to inspire, and to persuade. And you might have a presentation that does all 3 of those things. You might have a presentation that does a couple of those, or that has a primary purpose with one. If you are focusing in this class on either thinking about conference presentations or teaching, one of the key things you're going to be doing a lot of the time is to inform. And so it is a little bit more straightforward in the way you organize it, but there's no reason it can't also be inspiring, really interesting, really engaging. And so, yeah, it is helpful to think about these as their own categories of primary purpose, but you can really incorporate in aspects of different other purposes. I know that when I teach, I often have an aspect of persuasion. There's often, here's why you should care about this. Here's why this is interesting to me, and it should also be interesting to you. Here's why this is important. And so bringing that aspect of inspiration in there is really important to me, in addition to informing. Otherwise, if let's say I'm explaining a grammatical concept to a group of students, not inherently the most interesting thing for a lot of people. Here's how to use commas. I think a lot of students would almost automatically kind of sit back in their chair and say, I'm in for a boring 20 minutes. So there is an aspect of trying to sell how important this is. Sometimes the examples can incorporate humor or be a little funny, have an aspect that's performative. And that's something that you can do depending on your audience. That performative aspect or humor might not be as appropriate in a really formal setting like a conference, but in a classroom, if you're teaching or if you're presenting to peers and you know them and that level of humor or entertainment would be helpful, that's great. That is a great way to make things engaging. So that sort of brings us to this last piece that this chapter talks about, which is occasion. This is the context of where and when you're doing your presentation. Is it on Zoom? Is it pre-recorded like this is? Is it live in a room? Is it in a classroom on your campus? Or is it in a gigantic conference room at a conference, in a hotel banquet hall or something like that? Is it a big room? Is it a small room? Is it first thing in the morning? Is it 5 p.m. and it's the last thing of the day? How you engage with your audience, all of that fits into it. Where are you? When is this? What is the room like? How many people are there? One interesting point that that is in here that I think tracks very well with my experience in class, in live class, if certainly with student presenters, but sometimes I'm not great at incorporating humor. I'm not naturally that funny. Sometimes though something pops out and it is kind of funny and I can get a rise out of my students. I can get a laugh out of them. Certainly my students can get a laugh out of each other. Sometimes a lot of laughter, and it's really wonderful to see that. And often, you know, when you're in a room, laughter is contagious. Somebody's laughing, you feel like laughing, everybody starts laughing. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen on Zoom. And it doesn't happen on Zoom for very technological reasons. Usually when somebody is presenting, the others have their microphones off. Even if everyone's microphone is on, though, Zoom doesn't allow for multiple speakers at the same time. So if you hear laughter, you would be hearing one person laughing, and suddenly you wouldn't hear the speaker anymore. You wouldn't know if one person is laughing or 20 people are laughing. So Zoom doesn't really make it possible to get that sort of infectious laughter effect. I always suggest to students that if you're presenting on Zoom, you still could incorporate humor because it can be effective. Put your view in gallery view and look at your audience on one side and your slides or whatever on the other side. If you're looking at your audience, even if they're on mute, if they're laughing, that gives you the feedback that what you said was funny. Also, if the rest of us are looking on gallery view, we can at least see that visual cue of the rest of the audience. And so we can make it feel a little bit more like a live class. I do encourage always people to have their cameras on when they're in an audience on Zoom. I think it's just respectful. It's, you know, you're showing up. You're showing up. So when you're on Zoom, there's just different considerations. It doesn't quite work like a live classroom. If you're presenting asynchronously, you're recording a video, that doesn't give you any audience feedback. I'm talking right now to a camera. I can't see how you're reacting to what I say. I can't see if you're getting bored. I can't see if everybody's kind of checking out and checking their phones. Oh, I better make this more exciting and pick up the pace. So, you know, I don't have that feedback from the audience if I'm presenting asynchronously. I have to almost just kind of imagine my audience there and, you know, be able to, again, have that leap of imagination there. So I think the different contexts, asynchronous video recording, live on Zoom, live in a classroom, live at a conference, they're very different contexts. Another one, though, that's kind of interesting that's informal is you might be explaining your research or your work to someone who's interested in investing, and it might not be a big old presentation. They might just say, let's grab a cup of coffee or some lunch. Now you're sitting across a table from them, having a nice cup of coffee and talking to them about your research. It's not then a context where you can show them a big PowerPoint, though you might have a couple handouts you go through. You might rely more on story, more on narrative, and less on visuals in a case like that. So that's another context where you might have to explain something in a really engaging way, but it's very different from being in front of a classroom with a PowerPoint behind you. So do think about the physical setup of what you're doing, and make decisions based on that. I might have mentioned this in a previous video, but I always make sure with Zoom that my camera is low enough that my hands are in the frame when I'm talking, because I like to talk with my hands. I feel like that's part of what I do. And so if you can't see that, you're missing that piece. So even just the physical setup of where my video is something that I think about. I don't obsess about it. I don't, have one of those ring lights that makes my face look TikTok ready. But, I make sure I'm well lit enough. I make sure that my, face is in the frame and my arms, my hands are in the frame, and that you can see me being expressive. And so even that's part of the context of this presentation. So really, again, kind of the three key things: you're looking at audience, you're looking at purpose, and you're looking at the physical setup of where and when you are and how many people are in your audience. Really considering each of those systematically will help you plan a very engaging presentation. And another thing to recap is a couple questions that you can ask about any audience is, will the audience understand these details, and will they be interested? And you want the answer to be yes for both of those things. So thank you for listening to this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class.